March 14, 1968, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The morgue at Jefferson Hospital sat beneath flickering fluorescent lights, smelling of formaldehyde and institutional disinfectant. Thaddeus Merriweather, chief pathology examiner, leaned over the pale body of Alistair Bradshaw, 52 years old, former deputy director of the War Production Board. The man had died yesterday evening, at home, in his leather armchair. His wife found him with the evening newspaper still clutched in his hands, the Philadelphia Inquirer's business section folded to an article about post-war industrial reconstruction. She'd called an ambulance. The doctors pronounced him dead at the scene. Diagnosis: acute cardiac failure. Standard phrasing for a man of that age. No suspicions. No questions raised. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon at Laurel Hill Cemetery. But Thaddeus worked methodically. 30 years in the morgue had taught him never to rush. The body would tell the truth. He just had to know how to listen. He made the first incision with practiced precision. Opened the chest cavity. Examined the heart. Lifted it in his gloved hands. Turned it over carefully, studying every surface. A healthy heart. Dense myocardium. Elastic valves. Clean coronary vessels. No thrombosis. No atherosclerotic plaques. No signs of infarction whatsoever. Strange. Very strange indeed. If a man died from cardiac failure, the heart should show it. Enlarged chambers, thinned walls, scarring from previous incidents. Something. But here there was nothing. The organ looked like it belonged to someone 20 years younger. Thaddeus frowned. He continued the autopsy with increased attention. The liver. He lifted it carefully, feeling its weight in his hands. Too heavy. Much too heavy for a man of Bradshaw's build. He examined the surface closely. Bumpy. Nodular. The entire organ was covered with scar tissue, the surface texture rough and irregular. Like someone who'd suffered from severe cirrhosis for decades. But according to the medical records, Bradshaw didn't drink. The file was clear on this point. Healthy lifestyle, non-smoker, abstinent from alcohol, daily calisthenics every morning at 6, careful diet supervised by his personal physician. Where did such a liver come from? Thaddeus called for his assistant, a young man named Sterling Whitcomb, fresh out of medical school just a year ago, eager and bright-eyed. Sterling leaned in, peering at the damaged organ, examined it from multiple angles, paused, his brow furrowing. Answered uncertainly, Thaddeus nodded slowly. Quote 2, Sterling considered, running through his recent training. Quote 3, Thaddeus smiled slightly. Quote 4, the kidneys. Both shriveled and abnormal, reduced in size by at least 40%, hard as stone when he pressed them. The tissue destroyed, replaced by useless connective tissue. Thaddeus showed Sterling, pointing out the telltale signs. Underscore, quote, _5, _, the spleen. Enlarged to twice its normal size, the tissue dense and hardened. Lymph nodes throughout the body were calcified, turned to stone. The entire picture screamed one thing to Thaddeus's experienced eye: chronic heavy metal poisoning, most likely arsenic, given the specific pattern of organ damage. Sterling gasped, his face pale. Arsenic? But how? Who would do that? And for how long? Thaddeus removed his gloves carefully, dropping them in the medical waste bin. That's what we need to find out. But first, we'll complete the official report. Death from acute cardiac failure secondary to age-related changes. That's what's written on the intake form from the hospital. That's what we'll record in the primary diagnosis. But in the notes section, I'll add something important. Evidence of chronic intoxication detected in multiple organ systems. Additional investigation strongly recommended. That's all I can do from here. The rest is police business. They'll have to take it from there. That evening, Thaddeus sat at his kitchen table in his modest row house in South Philadelphia. Before him lay his work journal, a thick notebook with an oilcloth cover, worn from years of handling. 20 years of entries, hundreds of names of the deceased, diagnoses, autopsy peculiarities, unusual findings. He flipped through the pages slowly, looking for a pattern. He sensed deep in his gut that Bradshaw wasn't the first. There had been others, with the same signs, the same constellation of organ damage. He just needed to remember. He read through the entries methodically, year by year. 1965, 1964, 1963. There. Cornelius Tatum Whitfield, 47 years old, former regional director of the Office of Price Administration, died from hepatic failure. Thaddeus remembered that autopsy vividly. Also strange, liver destroyed, covered with the same nodular scarring, kidneys shriveled, spleen massively enlarged. The same picture, the same pattern. But he'd attributed it to alcoholism at the time. Whitfield drank heavily, everyone knew that. The man kept a flask in his desk drawer. But now, Thaddeus wondered, what if it wasn't just alcohol? What if there was something else? Something more sinister? He continued turning pages. 1966. Bartholomew Fletcher Crane, 55 years old, former deputy director of the National Defense Research Committee, death from pulmonary edema. Thaddeus remembered. The lungs had been filled with fluid, drowning him from the inside. But the liver was also damaged, the kidneys too. The same picture, again and again. He kept searching, growing more disturbed with each discovery. Found 5 more cases, all from the same building. The Winchester Arms, 1247 Rittenhouse Square. One of the most prestigious addresses in Philadelphia. All high-ranking wartime officials and industrialists, all aged between 47 and 55 years old. All died from supposedly natural causes over the past 20 years, but all had identical internal organ damage when he'd examined them. Necrotic liver covered with scar tissue, destroyed kidneys turned to useless stone, enlarged spleen. 8 men over 20 years, 1 building, 1 pattern of damage. This couldn't be coincidence. This was systematic. Thaddeus picked up the telephone, his hand trembling slightly, called the district police station, asked to speak with a detective. The duty officer asked what this concerned. Thaddeus answered carefully, quote, 8 quote. The duty officer paused, clearly taken aback, then connected the call without further questions. The next day, Thaddeus sat in a small, windowless interview room at the district police station. Captain Delphine Hartwell sat across from him, 35 years old, stern face with sharp features, short-cropped dark hair, pressed uniform with her badge polished to a shine. She listened to Thaddeus attentively, taking detailed notes in her pad with quick, efficient strokes. When he finished presenting his findings, she set down her pen, looked at the list of 8 names he'd written out, studied each one carefully. Mr. Merriweather, do you understand the seriousness of what you're saying? These are government officials, men who built America's war effort, mobilized industry for victory, heroes of production who helped defeat fascism. You're accusing someone of serial murder spanning 2 decades? Thaddeus shook his head firmly. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Captain. I'm stating medical fact. 8 men from the same building died with identical signs of chronic arsenic poisoning. Chronic, meaning prolonged over many years. Someone poisoned them systematically, small doses administered over months or years, so the deaths would appear natural, attributable to age or lifestyle. This requires a criminal investigation. These weren't natural deaths. Delphine drummed her fingers on the scarred wooden desk, silent, thinking hard, processing the implications. Then she nodded slowly. All right, I'll review the cases personally, study all the available materials, see if there's a connection beyond what you've found. But I'm warning you, Mr. Merriweather, if this turns out to be a false alarm, If you're seeing patterns that don't exist, you'll have to answer for defaming the memory of respected men. Their families could sue. Do you understand? Thaddeus met her gaze steadily. I understand completely, but I'm not wrong about this. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I know what I'm seeing. Investigate. You'll see for yourself. The truth is in the tissue. Captain Delphine Hartwell spent 2 intensive weeks reviewing the materials, working late into the night. During the day, she handled her regular caseload. At night, she studied the biographies of the 8 deceased men, looking for connections. What united them besides an address? What linked them across 2 decades? First victim, Major General Mortimer Caldwell Hayes, born 1897 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Veteran of the First World War, wounded at Belleau Wood. Division commander during training operations in preparation for D-Day. After the war, he worked at the Pentagon in a senior advisory capacity. Retired in 1947 with full honors. Moved to Philadelphia to be near his daughter. Received an apartment at the Winchester Arms on Rittenhouse Square. Died in November 1948 from a heart attack. 51 years old. Survived by wife, 3 children, 8 grandchildren. Second victim, Percival Quinlan Merritt. Born 1903 in Chester, Pennsylvania. Mechanical engineer educated at Drexel. Worked in defense manufacturing plants throughout the 1930s. From 1940 until 1945, director of the Frankfurt Arsenal, overseeing production of artillery shells and ammunition. Moved to Philadelphia in 1945 after the war ended. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in March 1951 from a massive stroke. 48 years old. Survived by wife and 2 sons. Third victim, Professor Edmund Horace Blackwell. Born 1901 in Boston, Massachusetts. Physicist educated at MIT. Specialist in radar technology and electronic warfare systems. Winner of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to the war effort. Moved to Philadelphia in 1940 to work at the University of Pennsylvania's research laboratories. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in July 1954 from renal failure. 53 years old. Survived by wife and 1 daughter. Delphine continued reading, taking careful notes. Fourth victim, Rutherford Ambrose Kendrick. Born 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. Georgetown University graduate. Government official with a background in journalism and public relations. From 1942 until 1945, director of a major division in the Office of War Information, managing domestic propaganda and morale operations. Moved to Philadelphia in 1938 when he married a local socialite. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in September 1957 from cardiac failure. 49 years old. Survived by wife, 4 children, 3 grandchildren. Fifth victim, Gideon Nathaniel Pemberton. Born 1910 in Richmond, Virginia. Naval architect educated at Webb Institute. Chief engineer at the Maritime Commission during the war, overseeing the emergency shipbuilding program. Moved to Philadelphia in 1943 to be closer to the shipyards. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in December 1960 from thrombosis. 50 years old. Survived by wife and 5 children. Sixth victim, Cornelius Tatum Whitfield. Born 1916 in Norfolk, Virginia. Economics degree from William and Mary. Regional director of the Office of Price Administration during the war, enforcing rationing and price controls. Moved to Philadelphia in 1950 after a promotion. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in May 1963 from hepatic failure, officially attributed to alcoholism. 47 years old. Survived by wife and 1 son. Seventh victim, Bartholomew Fletcher Crane. Born 1911 in New Haven, Connecticut. Yale-educated chemist. Deputy Director of the National Defense Research Committee, working on weapons development and industrial chemistry. Moved to Philadelphia in 1939 to take a position at DuPont's research division. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in August 1966 from pulmonary edema. 55 years old. Survived by wife, 2 daughters, 6 grandchildren. 8th victim, Alistair Quincy Bradshaw. Born 1916 in Wilmington, Delaware. Business administration degree from Penn. From 1940 until 1945, Deputy Director of the War Production Board, coordinating industrial output and resource allocation. Moved to Philadelphia in 1938 when he joined a major manufacturing firm. Apartment at the Winchester Arms. Died in March 1968 from cardiac failure. 52 years old. Survived by wife, 3 children, 2 grandchildren. Delphine stared at the list, looking for patterns. All different men. Military, engineers, scientists, bureaucrats, government officials. Different agencies and backgrounds, different specialties. But certain things connected them. All worked in positions of authority during World War II. All dealt with investigations, enforcement, or oversight. All had the power to make or break careers, to accuse or exonerate. And all lived at the same address, the Winchester Arms, 1,247 Rittenhouse Square, elite housing for the upper echelon of Philadelphia society. Built in 1930 specifically for government and industrial leaders, 9-story Art Deco masterpiece, high ceilings with ornate plasterwork, marble floors, crown molding, spacious kitchens with modern appliances, bathrooms with imported Italian fixtures, full-time doorman, private security, enclosed courtyard with fountain, the pinnacle of privilege. And 8 deaths over 20 years. Why this particular building? What was special about this location? Delphine called the building management office, requested a comprehensive list of all residents, past and present, and a complete list of service staff over the building's history. Doormen, cleaners, maintenance workers, housekeepers, everyone who had access to the apartments, who could enter the private spaces of residents. 3 days later, a messenger delivered a thick folder to her desk. Delphine began studying it methodically, cross-referencing names and dates. There were many residents over the years. Large building, 9 floors, 4 apartments per floor, 36 units total. Over 38 years of the building's existence, residents changed frequently. Some died of old age. Some moved to other cities. Some received promotions and relocated to even more prestigious addresses in New York or Washington. Delphine read through hundreds of names, looking for patterns, for anomalies. Nothing stood out initially. But then she opened the section documenting service staff. And there it was, the connection she'd been searching for. Housekeeper, Constance Felicity Drummond. Born 1923 in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Registered residence in Brandywine Township, Maple Road, house number 7. Working at the Winchester Arms since February 1948. Servicing apartments of government officials and their families. Duties included cleaning, cooking, laundry, ironing, minor household repairs. Reference from building management absolutely impeccable. Diligent worker, neat and thorough, quiet and unobtrusive. No complaints in 20 years of employment, no conflicts with residents, no disciplinary issues whatsoever. The perfect employee. Invisible, reliable, trusted. Delphine looked at the employment date with growing suspicion. Constance Drummond started working at the Winchester Arms in February 1948. The first death, Major General Hayes, occurred in November 1948. 9 months later. The second death, Percival Merritt, in March 1951. 3 years after Constance's hiring. The third, Professor Blackwell, in July 1954. 6 years after her hiring. And so on, a steady drumbeat of death. All 8 deaths occurred after Constance Drummond started working in the building. Every single one. Delphine felt a chill run down her spine. This couldn't be coincidence. She called building management again, asked for a detailed record of which specific apartments Constance Drummond had serviced. Who hired her? For what duties? when she started and ended employment with each resident, how much time she spent in each apartment. The information arrived 2 days later, delivered by hand. Delphine spread the papers across her desk, read through them carefully, highlighting key dates. What she found made her blood run cold. Constance Drummond had worked for all 8 deceased men at various times over her 20-year employment. For Major General Hayes from February 1948 until his death in November 1948. 8 months of employment. For Percival Merritt from January 1949 until his death in March 1951. Over 2 years. For Professor Blackwell from April 1951 until his death in July 1954. 3 years. For Rutherford Kendrick from August 1954 until his death in September 1957. 3 years. For Gideon Pemberton from October 1957 until his death in December 1960. 3 years. For Cornelius Whitfield from January 1961 until his death in May 1963. 2.5 years. For Bartholomew Crane from June 1963 until his death in August 1966. 3 years. For Alistair Bradshaw from September 1966 until his death in March 1968. 18 months. The pattern was absolutely clear. She worked for each victim from several months to several years. Then they died. Then she moved to the next one. Systematically, methodically, patiently, over 20 years. 8 victims, 1 killer, 1 method. Delphine picked up the phone with shaking hands, called the Chester County Sheriff's Office, asked them to locate Constance Drummond at her registered address, check if she was there. The sheriff called back 2 hours later. "Captain, we found her. She's at home. Quiet old lady. Lives alone. Tends her garden. Neighbors say she's harmless. Been there since before the war. What's this about?" Delphine answered carefully. "I need to question her about 8 suspicious deaths. Can you keep an eye on the house? Make sure she doesn't leave?" The sheriff sounded skeptical. "Captain, this lady is 65 years old, blind in one eye, walks with a cane. You sure about this?" Delphine was absolutely certain. "Very sure. I'm coming tomorrow morning. Don't let her out of your sight." The next morning, Delphine drove to Chester County, taking back roads through the countryside. Found the house on Maple Road after asking for directions twice. A small wooden cottage, white paint peeling in long strips, sagging front porch with broken boards. But the garden was absolutely immaculate. Roses blooming in perfect rows, vegetables planted in geometrically precise beds, not a single weed visible. She parked and walked to the front door, knocked firmly, waited. The door opened slowly. An elderly woman stood there, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, thick eyeglasses, simple blue cotton dress, white apron tied around her waist. She looked at Delphine with one good eye, the other clouded with cataracts. "Yes? Can I help you, dear?" Her voice was soft, grandmotherly. Delphine showed her badge. "Mrs. Drummond? I'm Captain Delphine Hartwell, Philadelphia Police Department. I need to ask you some questions about your employment at the Winchester Arms. May I come in?" Constance didn't flinch, didn't show the slightest surprise or concern, just nodded calmly. "Of course, Captain. Please come in. I'll make tea." As if a police captain visiting to discuss multiple deaths was the most normal thing in the world. The interior was modest but spotlessly clean. Simple wooden furniture polished to a shine, lace curtains on the windows, braided rug on the floor, everything in its place. And there, on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a photograph in a silver frame. A young man in a Navy uniform, handsome face, strong jawline, confident smile. Maybe 30 years old. Delphine pointed to it while Constance busied herself in the kitchen making tea. "Your husband?" Constance looked at the photo, and for the first time her expression softened, became almost tender. Yes, Graham. Graham Augustus Drummond. He died during the war, 1945, April 23rd, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, in the prison infirmary at Lewisburg Penitentiary. She said it matter-of-factly, as if reciting an address. Delphine sat down at the kitchen table, took out her notebook. Constance brought 2 cups of tea, set them down carefully, sat across from her. Delphine began. Mrs. Drummond, I'm investigating 8 deaths, all men who lived at the Winchester Arms on Rittenhouse Square. All your former employers over the past 20 years. Major General Mortimer Hayes, Percival Merritt, Professor Edmund Blackwell, Rutherford Kendrick, Gideon Pemberton, Cornelius Whitfield, Bartholomew Crane, and Alistair Bradshaw. Do you remember working for these men? Constance nodded slowly, sipping her tea. I remember them all, every single one. I worked for each of them. Good positions. They paid well. I needed the money for this house, for living expenses. They were satisfied with my work. I was thorough. Delphine leaned forward, watching Constance's face carefully for any tells. __quote, _24 __. Constance was silent for a long moment. She set down her teacup with a small clink, stood slowly, walked to the kitchen cupboard, opened it, reached to the back of the top shelf, brought down a glass mason jar. Inside was fine white powder. She set it on the table between them. Delphine stared at her, shocked despite being prepared for this. Constance nodded calmly. Delphine asked carefully, her pen poised over her notebook. __quote, _28 __. Constance sat back down, looked at the photograph of her husband for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, cold, emotionless, like reading from a script she'd memorized and rehearsed for decades. Those 8 men killed my Graham. Not directly. They didn't pull a trigger or swing a knife, but just as surely as if they had. And I'll tell you exactly how they did it, every detail. You'll want to write this down, Captain. She began to speak. The story poured out, clear, detailed, without the slightest trace of emotion, like reciting historical facts about someone else's life. __quote _30 __. Then, in August 1943, something happened at the Navy Yard. Some equipment went missing from the tool cribs. High-precision machine tools, micrometers, precision gauges, cutting equipment, worth thousands of dollars. Irreplaceable wartime equipment. The Navy launched a formal investigation. They suspected theft for black market resale, possible sabotage, maybe even espionage. This was taken very seriously. The investigation was led by a special civilian panel, 8 men, all appointed by the War Production Board and related wartime agencies. They had broad authority to question workers, review records, access personnel files, make recommendations for prosecution. Those 8 men were Major General Mortimer Hayes, Percival Merritt, Professor Edmund Blackwell, Rutherford Kendrick, Gideon Pemberton, Cornelius Whitfield, Bartholomew Crane, and Alistair Bradshaw. The same 8 men I later killed. The same 8 men who destroyed my life. Quote _31 _. They fabricated evidence, forged documents showing he'd signed out equipment on days he wasn't even at work. Found a witness, a man named Eugene Kowalski who owed money to loan sharks, who claimed to have seen Graham loading tools into a truck in the parking lot at midnight. Pure fiction. All lies. Every word. But the panel submitted their report to the Navy's legal office, recommended immediate prosecution for theft of government property, sabotage, and aiding the enemy. During wartime, those charges carried severe penalties. Possible death sentence. Graham was arrested at our apartment in October 1943, handcuffed in front of me, dragged away while I screamed and cried. Constance paused, took a sip of tea. Her hand was perfectly steady. He got a lawyer, court-appointed public defender, young man named Thomas Richter, fresh out of law school, inexperienced, overworked, handling 20 cases at once. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented the forged documents, the false witness testimony from Kowalski, the panel's official report with their conclusions. Graham's lawyer tried to fight back, called character witnesses, showed Graham's actual time cards proving he wasn't at work when the equipment was allegedly stolen. But he was outmatched. The prosecutor was a decorated Navy captain with 15 years of experience. The jury convicted after 4 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Graham to 15 years in federal prison at hard labor. He was sent to Lewisburg Penitentiary in January 1944. Cell Block D, number 2847. I visited him once a month, took the train from Philadelphia, 4 hours each way. Brought him letters I'd written every day, photos, news from home, books. He told me he'd survive. He'd serve his time, keep his head down, work hard, then come home to me. We'd start over, buy that house, have those children. But prison destroyed him. The work was brutal, breaking rocks in the quarry, building roads. The conditions were terrible. Overcrowded cells, bad food, inadequate medical care. The guards were cruel, especially to prisoners convicted of wartime offenses. In April 1945, just 3 weeks before Germany surrendered, Graham collapsed during work detail. Massive heart attack. He was 43 years old. Healthy man, strong, should have lived another 30 years. They called me, told me to come identify the body. They'd already buried him in the prison cemetery by the time I arrived. Plot number 247. No headstone, just a wooden marker with his prisoner number. I stood at his grave in the rain, looked at that wooden marker, and I knew the absolute truth. Those 8 men had murdered him. They'd lied, fabricated evidence, destroyed an innocent man to further their careers, to look effective, to get promotions. And they'd gotten away with it completely. All 8 received career advancement after the investigation. Hayes made Major General. Merritt became director of Frankfurt Arsenal. Blackwell got his Presidential Medal. All of them prospered, built successful careers, lived in luxury, while my Graham rotted in an unmarked grave like a common criminal. Like garbage. I tried the legal route first. Spent 3 years writing letters. To the War Department, the Justice Department, the FBI. My congressmen, my senators, told them Graham was innocent, provided evidence, character witnesses willing to testify, work records proving he couldn't have stolen the equipment. His time card showed he was on shift in a different building when the thefts occurred. But nobody cared. The war was over. Everyone wanted to move on. Forget. Put it behind them. My letters were ignored, filed away. Eventually, I stopped receiving even form letter replies. Graham remained a convicted criminal in the official records. I remained the wife of a traitor and a thief. That's what they called him. A traitor. People would spit when they heard his name. So I realized I had to take matters into my own hands. If the system wouldn't deliver justice, I would do it myself. I spent 3 years researching, planning, learning. I learned everything about those 8 men, where they lived, where they worked, their daily habits, their families, their routines, their preferences. I discovered that several already lived at the Winchester Arms. Others would move there eventually. It was the prestigious address for successful wartime officials in Philadelphia. Perfect. I applied for work there as a housekeeper in late 1947, was hired in February 1948. I was 25 years old, my whole life ahead of me. But I dedicated it to one single purpose: making those 8 men pay for what they'd done to Graham. I researched poisons extensively, read medical textbooks at the library, pharmacology journals, toxicology papers. I learned about arsenic, how it works at the cellular level, how it accumulates in soft tissues, how to administer it so the symptoms mimic natural degenerative illness. I bought rat poison, pure arsenic trioxide, easy to obtain at any hardware store, no questions asked. I started with Major General Hayes. He hired me in February 1948 to help his wife with housework. She had arthritis, couldn't manage the large apartment alone. I cooked for them, cleaned, earned their complete trust. They treated me like family. Then I began. Small amounts of arsenic in his morning coffee every single day. A tiny bit dissolved in his soup at lunch. A trace in his evening brandy. Not enough to cause acute symptoms, just enough to slowly, imperceptibly destroy his liver, his kidneys, his cardiovascular system. Over 9 months, his health declined gradually. Doctors attributed it to age, to stress from his military service, to normal aging. In November 1948, he died in his sleep. Official cause? Heart attack. Natural death. I attended his funeral at the family's request, brought flowers, cried with his widow, hugged his children. They thanked me for being such a devoted employee. Then, I moved to my next target. Percival Merritt hired me in January 1949. His wife had just died of cancer. He needed help managing the household. Same pattern: cooking, cleaning, building trust, then poison. But with Merritt, I was more patient. Worked for him 2.5 years before he died. Wanted to avoid any pattern. Wanted each death to seem completely unrelated to the others. Varied the timeline. Varied the apparent cause. In March 1951, he died from a massive stroke. I moved to Professor Blackwell, then to Kendrick, then to Pemberton, then to Whitfield, then to Crane, finally to Bradshaw. 20 years, 8 men, each one poisoned slowly, carefully, methodically, each death appearing completely natural, age-related, expected, no suspicions, no investigations, until now. I never felt guilt, never regretted a single moment, not one dose of poison, not one death. These men destroyed my husband, destroyed our future together, destroyed me. They deserved everything they got. More, actually. Graham suffered for 2 years in that hellhole prison before his heart gave out. They got off easy. Relatively quick deaths. No real prolonged suffering. Just gradual decline. Comfortable homes. Loving families around them at the end. Graham died alone on a prison floor with a guard yelling at him to get up and stop malingering. But at least they're dead now. At least they paid something for what they'd done to an innocent man. Constance fell silent. Looked directly at Delphine with her one good eye. "That's my full confession, Captain. You can arrest me now. I won't resist. I've accomplished what I set out to do 20 years ago. All 8 are dead. Graham is avenged. His death has been paid for 8 times over. I'm ready to face whatever consequences the law demands. I've been ready for years." Delphine sat stunned, her pen frozen over her notebook. She'd heard confessions before in her career, dozens of them, but never anything like this. Never something so calculated, so cold, so perfectly executed over 2 decades. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was systematic revenge carried out with absolute precision. She stood slowly, took out her handcuffs. "Constance Felicity Drummond, you're under arrest for the murders of 8 men. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." She read the full Miranda rights while Constance listened quietly, still sitting at her kitchen table. When Delphine finished, Constance stood. held out her wrists without being asked. "I understand my rights perfectly, Captain. I waive them all. I'll confess everything again, in writing, on tape, in court, wherever you need me to. Let's go. I'm ready." The trial began 6 months later, in October 1968. Philadelphia Criminal Court, Judge Harrison Pembroke presiding. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Walter Gaines, presented overwhelming evidence. Constance's detailed confession, given freely and repeatedly. The medical examiner's reports showing chronic arsenic poisoning in all 8 victims' remains. Several bodies were exhumed for additional testing. The jar of arsenic found in her home tested and confirmed as pure arsenic trioxide. Her employment records showing she'd worked for each victim before their deaths. The timeline perfectly aligned across 20 years. The prosecution called it the most elaborate serial killing in American legal history, premeditated to an unprecedented degree, cold-blooded, systematic, without the slightest trace of remorse. The defense attorney, court-appointed because Constance had no money, tried to argue diminished capacity, post-traumatic stress from her husband's wrongful conviction and death, depression, mental illness brought on by grief and injustice. But Constance refused to cooperate with her own defense. She fired her attorney after 2 days, chose to represent herself. She stood before the jury of 12 citizens, spoke clearly and calmly. Quote, 40 __. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, returned with their verdict. Guilty on all 8 counts of first-degree murder. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. Constance stood. Quote, 41 __. Judge Pembroke sentenced her to 8 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. She was 45 years old. She'd spend the rest of her natural life in prison. She accepted the sentence without flinching, without showing any emotion. Just nodded once and allowed the bailiffs to lead her away in handcuffs. But Constance's claim about fabricated evidence intrigued certain people. A journalist named Meredith Blackstone from the Philadelphia Inquirer decided to investigate the underlying story. She requested the 1943 Navy Yard investigation files through the Freedom of Information Act. It took 14 months of bureaucratic back and forth, but eventually the documents arrived in 12 boxes. Meredith spent weeks reviewing every page, and she found exactly what Constance had claimed. Smoking guns throughout the files, discrepancies in the evidence against Graham Drummond, major inconsistencies in witness testimony. The timeline of equipment thefts didn't match Graham's documented work schedule. His punch cards showed he was clocked in at a different building when several thefts occurred. The documents purporting to show he'd signed out equipment had different ink, different paper stock than other forms from that period. Obviously forged. The witness, Eugene Kowalski, who claimed to see Graham loading a truck, had received a $50 payment from the investigation panel 1 week before giving his testimony, documented in a voucher marked investigative expenses. Clear bribery. The whole case was a complete fraud from top to bottom. Meredith published her findings in a major 5-part series of articles in early 1970. The Housekeeper's Revenge: How 8 war officials framed an innocent man and paid with their lives. The articles caused a national sensation. Public opinion shifted dramatically and divided sharply. Some people began to see Constance not as a monster, but as a victim, a woman who'd lost everything to corrupt officials and taken justified vengeance. Others maintained she was a cold-blooded serial killer who'd murdered 8 elderly men, regardless of what they'd done decades earlier. The debate raged in newspapers across the country, on television talk shows, in magazine editorials, in courtrooms as lawyers argued about legal precedent. Legal scholars published papers discussing whether her actions constituted justifiable revenge or premeditated murder. Ethicists held symposiums debating whether systematic injustice justified vigilante violence. Philosophers argued about the fundamental nature of justice itself and whether the state holds a monopoly on punishment. 3 years after her conviction, in 1971, the federal government posthumously exonerated Graham Augustus Drummond. Officially admitted the evidence against him had been fabricated by the investigative panel, cleared his name from all criminal records, issued an official apology to his memory, offered Constance financial compensation, $50,000 for the wrongful imprisonment and death of her husband. She refused from her prison cell, wrote back in a brief, pointed letter, __quote _ 44 __. The letter was leaked to the press by someone in the Justice Department, published nationwide, made her even more controversial. A folk hero to some who saw her as standing up to corrupt power, a terrifying monster to others who saw her as taking the law into her own hands with horrifying consequences. Constance Drummond served 15 full years in the Women's Correctional Facility in Muncie, Pennsylvania, from 1968 to 1983. She was 60 years old when they released her, not 80 as some newspaper reports incorrectly stated. Blind in both eyes by then from untreated cataracts, deaf in one ear, could barely walk even with a cane. The prison administration called her to the warden's office on a cold November morning, told her. Constance nodded slowly, asked in her quiet voice, "They checked the property records." Constance sighed with relief. They gave her civilian clothes, the same ones she'd worn 15 years earlier. Blue cotton dress, now yellow with age, gray cardigan with moth holes, old brown shoes with worn soles. Everything threadbare. But there was nothing else. Constance dressed slowly, her arthritic fingers struggling with the buttons. Walked out of prison for the first time in 15 years, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight. She took a Greyhound bus to Chester County, the 3-hour journey feeling like traveling through a foreign country. Everything had changed. Found her house on Maple Road with help from a kind neighbor who recognized the address. The gate had fallen completely, lying in the weeds. The fence had rotted away to nothing. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle. Windows broken, replaced by pieces of cardboard. The house was dying, slowly collapsing in on itself. Like her. Constance pushed open the front door, the hinges screaming. Walked inside. Looked around at the ruins. Everything covered in thick mold and mildew. The floors warped and rotting. Walls blackened with water damage. But the furniture remained where she'd left it. Table, chairs, bed, stove. Everything as it had been, just older and more decrepit. Constance walked slowly to the table, brushed off thick dust with her sleeve, pulled from her pocket the photograph of Graham in his Navy uniform, the same one she'd kept hidden through 15 years of prison, against regulations. Set it on the table in the exact spot it had always occupied, looked at it with her failing eyes, barely able to make out his beloved features. Whispered to the image, "My love, my darling Graham, I'm home at last. It's finished. All 8 answered for what they did to you. You've been exonerated, truth restored, your name cleared. Now we can be together again. Finally, after all these years." She walked to the bed, lay down fully clothed, closed her eyes, smiled genuinely, for the first time in many, many years. Constance lived another 2 years in that decaying house. Neighbors occasionally saw her in the overgrown garden, digging feebly in the vegetable rows with a hand trowel, planting potatoes, pulling weeds, moving slowly, bent nearly double, silent, solitary, nearly blind. She never spoke to anyone if she could avoid it. A woman named Agnes Porter from the next property over brought her bread twice a week. Milk, sometimes eggs. Asked how she was doing, if she needed anything. Constance answered in single words, barely audible. "Fine, managing, thank you." Nothing more. Agnes didn't press for conversation. She understood. This woman had lived through unimaginable things. Best to leave her in peace. Let her finish out her days undisturbed. In October 1985, on a cold Tuesday, Agnes Porter noticed no smoke rising from Constance's chimney by evening. Unusual. Constance always lit the wood stove by 4 o'clock as the autumn darkness fell. Agnes felt a sense of foreboding, walked over through the fallen leaves, knocked on the door. No answer. Called out. Silence. Pushed the door open, went inside, her heart heavy. Constance lay on the bed, hands folded peacefully on her chest. Graham's photograph placed carefully on the pillow beside her head. Face calm, almost happy, almost content. Agnes checked for a pulse at the withered neck. Nothing. Gone. She called the county coroner. The coroner arrived 90 minutes later, examined the body briefly, declared death. Cause: natural causes, heart failure due to advanced age and general systemic failure. Estimated she'd been dead about 12 hours. No signs of violence or distress. Natural death. They buried Constance Felicity Drummond 3 days later in the Chester County Memorial Cemetery. About 10 people attended the brief service, neighbors who'd known her slightly, curious onlookers who'd read about her case. Journalist Meredith Blackstone drove from Philadelphia, now middle-aged herself, laid white roses on the plain coffin, said quietly, quote, 51. They filled the grave with dark earth, put up a simple granite headstone paid for by Meredith. Inscription read, quote, 52. Constance's story didn't end with her death and burial. It continued living, evolving, being reinterpreted, in newspaper articles and academic papers, in court records and case law citations, in archives and libraries, in people's memories and dinner table debates. Journalist Meredith Blackstone wrote a full-length book in 1987, 20 Years of Patience, the story of a housekeeper who avenged her husband's murder. The book became a surprise bestseller, staying on the New York Times list for 18 weeks. Readers across the country debated passionately: hero or monster, victim or executioner, justified revenge or inexcusable crime, justice or murder. Opinions split sharply and remained divided. Some said, she did exactly right, restored justice where the system had failed completely, punished the guilty when courts wouldn't. Those men destroyed an innocent life. They deserved what they got. The system failed Graham Drummond. She succeeded where the system failed. That's true justice. Others said, she's a calculating murderer, cold-blooded and patient, dangerous beyond measure. She killed 8 elderly men over 2 decades, without trial, without due process, without legal authority. She appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner. That's completely unacceptable in a civilized society. 2 wrongs don't make a right. She became as bad as them, or worse. What happened to the families of the 8 murdered men? The children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? They learned the devastating truth about their ancestors, that their grandfathers weren't heroes, weren't patriots, were instead informants, liars, men who destroyed an innocent person to advance their careers. Some family members acknowledged their ancestors' guilt, publicly asked forgiveness of Graham Drummond's memory, visited Brandywine Township, brought flowers to Constance's grave, said through tears, __quote_56___. Others vehemently denied it, refused to believe the documentary evidence, insisted their grandfather couldn't possibly have done such things, that it was all lies, slander, historical revisionism, communist propaganda, government conspiracy, anything but the truth. Families split apart along these fault lines. Adult children disowned their parents over the arguments. Grandchildren rejected their family names, refused to carry the burden of ancestral guilt, refused to bear surnames now associated with corruption and betrayal. Pathology examiner Thaddeus Merriweather, who first noticed the telltale signs of poisoning in Alistair Bradshaw's organs, continued working at Jefferson Hospital's morgue until age 70. Retired in 1975 with full honors, died in 1981 from complications of a stroke, his mind sharp until the very end. Before his death, he gave a lengthy interview to a local newspaper, said reflectively, "The Drummond case taught me one fundamental thing about my profession. The dead always tell the truth. They can't lie. They can't dissemble. You just have to listen carefully. I saw clear signs of arsenic poisoning in Bradshaw's body. Could have easily stayed silent. Signed the standard cardiac failure report. Let it go. Nobody would have known. But I couldn't do that. My conscience wouldn't allow it. Because I spoke up, because I listened to what the dead were telling me, justice was eventually restored. Late, bloody, terrible, but justice nonetheless. Graham Drummond was exonerated 28 years after his death. His name was cleared from the criminal records. 8 corrupt officials who destroyed him answered for their crimes. To his widow, to his memory, to history. That's a kind of justice. Harsh, imperfect, but real justice nonetheless. Detective Delphine Hartwell continued her distinguished police service for over 20 years after the Drummond case, rose steadily through the ranks to deputy chief, retired in 1990 with full pension and numerous commendations, gave a reflective interview to the Philadelphia Inquirer on her last day, said thoughtfully, "The Drummond case was the hardest, most morally complex case in my entire career. Nothing else came close." On one hand, Constance Drummond murdered 8 men, killed them deliberately, cold-bloodedly, methodically, planned it meticulously for 20 years. That's clearly premeditated murder under any legal definition. Crime. Evil. On the other hand, those 8 men were criminals themselves. They destroyed her husband Graham with completely fabricated accusations, false evidence, perjured testimony, bribery. Sent an innocent man to federal prison where he died. They did this knowingly, deliberately, for career advancement, for promotions, for prestige. Who's right? Who's wrong in this situation? The law says Constance was guilty of murder. She's a serial killer. End of discussion. Conscience says everyone was guilty. Her and them. All 9 people. I honestly don't know the right answer after all these years. I only know this one thing with certainty. A system that allows innocent people to be destroyed by false accusations, that refuses to investigate or correct its own mistakes, that values careers over justice. That system creates avengers like Constance Drummond. While there's injustice, while the system fails, there will always be people who want to restore balance with their own hands, using their own methods, outside the law, violently if necessary. That's terrifying. But it's reality. The Drummond case proves it. The Winchester Arms on Rittenhouse Square still stands today, nearly 60 years after the last death. Same 9 floors, same elegant Art Deco facade with geometric decorative elements, same marble lobby. But the residents have completely changed over generations. The wartime government officials are long gone, dead or moved away. Their apartments were sold. New owners moved in. Business people, corporate executives, doctors, lawyers, artists, athletes. They live comfortable lives, enjoy the prestigious address, host dinner parties, raise children. They don't know the building's dark history, don't know that in these very apartments a serial killer operated for 20 years? That 8 units were sites of slow execution by poison. That the quiet housekeeper in the blue dress was an angel of death moving methodically from apartment to apartment. They just live their normal lives. The history remains buried in the past, in dusty archives, in yellowing newspapers, in the fading memories of those few who still remember. A lesson about how injustice breeds revenge, how lies generate death, how evil returns, always, sooner or later. One way or another, through expected channels or unexpected ones. The Drummond case stands as a permanent reminder that when the legal system fails to deliver justice, someone will inevitably try to deliver it themselves. And the cost of that private justice is always terrible, for everyone involved, for the avenger, for the victims, for their families, for society itself. 8 men dead. 1 woman's life consumed by revenge, countless family members scarred. All because 8 officials chose career advancement over truth. All because the system refused to admit its mistakes. The price of injustice, paid in full, over 20 patient years.